Now, the single biggest factor in inflation is the money supply, which I explained in my lesson on the Federal Reserve System, but I'll explain it here in a bit more detail. The laws of supply and demand apply to money itself. If you have a glut of apples at the market, you can only sell them for a few pennies a pound. But if you have the world's most delicious apple, imported from Aomori, Japan, a rare crop that is imported in very limited numbers, you can charge $5 a pound for those apples. Dollars are no different. If there are too many dollars in the free market, their purchasing power declines. They have less value, just like it was in the late 70s when the US had double-digit inflation. Also, during the Great Depression, the money supply was severely constricted, and each dollar had tremendous purchasing power. That extreme isn't good either, because the super constricted money supply is actually what caused the Depression in the first place. If you want to learn more about how the constricted money supply caused the Great Depression, please check out Milton Friedman's video. There's a link in the sidebar. This equation is how economists see what I have just explained. Economists have a real talent for taking a very simple concept and representing it with a bunch of complex notation loaded with Greek symbols that can confuse nearly anyone, including themselves. Now, I know I'm being a bit facetious here, and I thought about breaking this down for you and demonstrating mathematically how this works, but I really don't want to put you to sleep. What I find particularly frustrating about this is that economists often put up a technical barrier that the general public just doesn't understand, and this allows for third parties to come in and manipulate and deceive the general public. Before we move on, there are two terms I'd like you to be familiar with: real and nominal. In the world of finance and economics, these two terms have a unique meaning. Whenever you see the term real in front of something, real rate of return, real GDP, real whatever, it means these things have been adjusted for inflation. For example, if you put money in the bank and they're offering you a 3% rate of return, and inflation is 1%, your real rate of return is 2%. Now let's take another guy in country B, who just happens to have a currency that equals 1 to 1 to the US dollar. But their inflation rate in his country is 12%, and the bank is paying 7%. His real rate of return would be negative 5%. A nominal number isn't adjusted for inflation. For example, your bank statement isn't adjusted for inflation. So the guy in country B, when he gets his bank statement at the end of the year, he's going to have a higher balance than you. But you will be able to purchase more goods and services with your fewer dollars than he'll be able to purchase in his country. But this is just to illustrate a point. It's always important to consider the inflation rate, because what matters at the end of the day is how much you'll be able to purchase with your dollars, not the nominal amount of dollars you have in the bank. Another example that might hit a little closer to home. Say that you received a 3% raise at work, and inflation is 4%. Your real pay raise is negative 1%. And while your employer may be paying you more money nominally, you're getting a bigger check each week, his real costs have gone down, and your purchasing power has gone down. Now, speaking of employment, when we are hit with high inflation, there's always a lag time between rising prices and rising salaries. This is always a difficult adjustment, and people with low incomes are most severely impacted by inflation. But eventually salaries will catch up with inflation. But once your salary catches up with inflation, the pain isn't over. You'll be getting a bigger paycheck, and you might think you can afford these higher prices. But if you live in the US or most Western European nations, they have a progressive tax system, which means the more money you make, the higher the tax rate. So because of inflation, prices go up and you'll have a harder time making ends meet until your salary catches up. But your new higher salary most likely bumped you up into the next higher tax bracket, where you're going to be paying a higher percentage of your income in taxes. The government's going to be taking a bigger bite of your apple. And while things may be a little better, you still don't have the purchasing power you did before the inflation came. This is one of the many reasons why progressive taxation is progressively unfair. In the future, I'll be making a video about tax policy. High inflation, 10%, 12%, and hyperinflation, like in Zimbabwe, where it costs $1 billion to buy 3 eggs, really hurt people because their money has less value. They're able to buy less and less. The people who are hurt the most are often seniors who live on a fixed income and their life savings are completely eroded. Inflation is like a tax no one voted for or legislated. Think if you had a 20% tax on everything you bought. You would never again vote for the politicians who legislated that tax. But inflation is really a form of stealth taxation, and bad fiscal and monetary policy is often what creates inflation. But a small and stable inflation rate is actually healthy, between 1 and 4%. If you are like me and most people living in America, you have student loans, maybe a mortgage on a home, with a small inflation rate, one that doesn't hinder economic growth, over time it'll make it easier and easier for you to pay off your loans. Say if you have a 30-year fixed mortgage at 6% and inflation is 4%, the real rate of your mortgage is then 2%. Year after year, as inflation compounds, you're paying back your loan with inflated dollars. So over time, it becomes much easier to pay down your debt. So a very small inflation rate year to year isn't going to have major negative impacts on the economy and provides debt relief to many over time.
So why has inflation been so low in the US for so long? Why haven't we seen the return of Jimmy Carter-style double-digit inflation? There are five major contributing factors. The first factor relates to conditions in international markets. Throughout much of the 90s, there was a depressed Asian economy that provided cheap goods to the US. This helped prevent cost-push inflation. The second factor relates to productivity. Increases in technology and the internet have made doing business cheaper and faster. And if your boss catches you wasting time on Facebook, you're still probably more productive than you could have been before the rise of the internet. The US has the highest productivity in the world. We work longer hours and take less vacation time. Human resources are often the biggest expense for most companies, and because Americans are so productive with their time at work, companies are able to offer goods and services at much lower costs than compared to the socialist nations of Europe. Another factor in what gives the US such a high productivity rating is our at-will employment system. At-will means you have the freedom to leave a job whenever you want and go to another job you like better. And if you're happier, doing more rewarding work, you're more productive.
It also means employers can quickly weed out unproductive employees.
In the socialist nations of Europe, their intrusive regulations make it very difficult for companies to remove unproductive employees. And when they are able to cut staff, they are required by law to provide very expensive severance packages. It's also difficult to switch careers in most socialist nations in Europe. The third factor in our low inflation rates in recent times is due to the fact the US dollar has stayed strong up until the early 2000s. And while the dollar did lose some value in more recent years, it has remained stable. And the full effects of the devaluation of the dollar in international markets has yet to be fully realized. A strong dollar has allowed U.S. firms to purchase raw materials cheaply in the international market, again fending off cost-push inflation. The fourth factor I've explained in my video on the Federal Reserve. Up until very recent times, we have had very tight monetary policy. The Federal Reserve under Alan Greenspan's leadership kept a very tight money supply. And the final factor is due to low expectations in the U.S. Price levels have increased very slowly, and Americans haven't felt the need to rush major purchases or to hoard up on personal items. The business world has been able to successfully implement things like just-in-time inventory practices and only buying items as needed. These low expectations have helped fend off demand pull inflation. Now in the next segment, I'm going to start talking about deflation.
Now,